Hello, 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 and welcome back to the IBS Freedom Podcast. As you can see, we have a special guest today, and I am super pumped about this. I lined this up, like a month or more ago, and I've been just waiting for this day ever since because I think this is going to be such an important and helpful episode for you guys. So we are joined today by Jessica Brown. She's a clinical nutritionist who I recently took a course with and found stupendously useful and insightful. And I'm so excited to share this. But you are the author of The Loving Diet, and you can be found on the internet at various handles of The Loving Diet. So that's your Instagram handle, I think, is The Loving Diet.
Yep.
Are you on TikTok? I feel like that's your TikTok as well.
Yep.
Your website. You're very consistent with that. So you should be pretty easy to find. But welcome to the IBS Freedom Podcast, Jessica.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been excited to come on and talk to you both.
I know, I'm excited too.
If I may, can I start by sharing just a minute or two of how we met and what the class was? And then that'll kind of dovetail into why I thought this was going to be useful to people.
Absolutely.
So, your class for practitioners, and hopefully I'm summarizing this in a way that is appropriate, because now it's like I'm doing a presentation for the teacher. Oh no. But basically the class to me was how to support people in their eating, particularly if they have a lot of food fear or history of disordered eating, or like if the idea of eating intuitively doesn't feel super intuitive to them, right? And that was one thing I wanted to lead off with is I feel like a lot of people who listen to our podcast are familiar with the idea of intuitive eating. Maybe they've read the book, maybe they follow online gurus that talk about intuitive eating. Do you want to catch us up and just maybe briefly summarize intuitive eating and then kind of add to that where your world folds in and where this loving diet stuff folds in and where people can kind of get lost with the intuitive eating stuff?
It's a great place to start. So I'm a clinical nutritionist and a self-compassion teacher. And so I have this really cool intersect of working with people who, for the most part, have tried intuitive eating, and it's come up really short for them, and they don't understand why, and then they start to feel like it's another thing that they have perhaps failed at. So when we look at what intuitive eating is, it's when we stop looking at foods as good or bad, and we start listening to our body, and we eat what feels right. Which is a very cool concept in theory, but when we look at people who have chronic health issues, or even people who, for instance, have a high ACE score and they've had a lot of traumatizing events, it isn't necessarily easy to listen to your body and eat what feels right because there's a lot of interference. And we know that chronic illness is a tremendous interference for being able to accurately interpret what your body is telling you. And so I'd say intuitive eating is very cool in its concept, and in the world that I work in, very few people are able to actually do it because they don't know all of the beliefs that they hold to be true that aren't necessarily true, that are impacting how they interpret signals like, oh, I'm full, oh, I'm hungry. And it seems we've made an oversimplification of people's ability to do that, especially in the chronic illness world. So I work in that area.
And that was such a good summary. And correct me if I'm wrong, that maybe intuitive eating as it stands right now would perhaps be better suited for people with few or no health issues versus like the more health issues and the more complex and the more severe the health issues and the history of traumatizing events becomes. It's like there's that many more barriers between you and your ability to listen to your body.
100%.
Right? So great for like the average Joe Jane America, maybe not so much for the people that we would work with clinically or the people who would listen to this podcast, honestly.
Correct. And also people who have a really complicated emotional history. When we look at how many, for instance, women, I'll just use women because there's the statistic, how many women in the United States suffer from a form of disordered eating, it's pushing 70 to 75%. That would mean that there are factors unique to them and their life chronic illness is one of them, that could be just causing a disordered eating relationship with food. And intuitive eating is great for people who are sort of like clean slate. They don't have a complicated health history and they don't have a complicated emotional history. It's a great end goal, but for a lot of us that live in this world, our life hasn't been uncomplicated. It's been quite complicated. And so intuitive eating is, like I said, great in theory, but I work in the world of how do I actually figure out how to eat and how to trust myself eating. And that's where self-compassion comes in. And Nikki, the class that you and I did together, really teaches the skills of self-compassion and reparenting as a runway to prepare yourself that maybe at a later time you'll be prepared to do intuitive eating.
Yeah, intuitive eating is such an interesting space because I remember specifically being in a dietetics lecture that was filled with more conventional dietitians who did not like the idea of intuitive eating at all, much more into, I feel like dietitians in general are a bit more type A. Like they like the sense of control from a dietary standpoint, but a lot of the issues that you're describing, they have too. But I also, again, I think it's like you said, it's such an interesting and good in theory way of eating if there isn't problems and breakdowns that might be affecting how you're reading the signals the body is sending you. And I think with our clientele, because there's so much bloating or pain or like some of these physical symptoms and sensations that they're experiencing in their body, that is probably the biggest factor that I've seen that prevents people from truly intuitive eating and being able to nourish their body properly. And then again, I think the other one would be just some of the ideas around like this food causes bloating, so I need to avoid all these foods that fit into these categories. And I need to trust the experts know what they're talking about, and then I need to avoid all these foods. And I can't trust my body to make those decisions. So I think there's a restrictive nature that kind of prevents people from being able to read body cues because they're getting all this messaging that these foods are good and these foods are bad. But I also think the other big category is just physically people struggling to nourish their body properly. And I think I've definitely run into problems with clients where we assess their intake and they say, well, I feel too full to eat, but they have like 1,000 calorie deficit. And it's like, well, we need to get you to a point where you can get the nutrition in so then you can maybe properly read your appetite and hunger cues and not feel so full. So it's just such a tricky scenario, I think, when there's some digestive breakdowns that might be telling someone, hey, you're full, you've had enough, you have early satiety, but then they are not nourished. That's such a tricky scenario, and I think it's what you're describing. Like when there's chronic issues, you really can't do intuitive eating. But I think some people think that they are. They're like, oh, I'm doing it. I'm able to read my cues. I can't go further. But in reality, they need to move forward with their health. And that's so challenging.
Well, I have two more things to bring up too, and then maybe we'll throw it back to Jessica here. But the idea of listening to your body or trusting your body, I think we've talked about this a little bit before, but I think it's like that medically induced PTSD thing that I've brought up before, where, okay, on the one hand, you don't feel well. And that alone can bring up these feelings of like, why would my body do this to me? Why can't my gut do its job right? Why is it out to get me? Why is the SIBO out to get me? Why is the Candida out to get me? It's me versus the Candida, me versus the SIBO. Like a lot of just the nature of feeling unwell fosters an inability to listen to your body, right? Like you start to not trust your body because on some level, I think a lot of people feel like their body did this to them. or their body failed them somehow. So
Their
you have
body's
that
broken.
layer first.
Sorry, they feel
Yeah, like
broken
I'm
in some way.
broken.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then there's the extra special layer where you go to healthcare professionals, oftentimes many of them, and then they further teach you to not trust your body in a multitude of different ways, right? On the conventional side, people will go to GI doctors and they'll be told, your colonoscopy is good, your endoscopy is good, your blood work is good, you don't have celiac disease, you don't have Crohn's, you don't have colitis. There's nothing wrong with you. It's just IBS. Here's an antidepressant, or here, you just need an anxiety medication or a psych eval. And like, so the conventional side basically tells these people, the people who listen to us at least, it's all in your head, you're fine. But then the functional side is oftentimes just as bad, because then you get this weird dynamic where people will say one thing, but then the functional space is so married to and obsessed with their freaking functional tests that people will come in and somebody would say, oh, well, I don't have an issue when I eat dairy. Well, this food sensitivity test tells me otherwise. OMG, you can't listen to your perception of how you feel when you eat dairy. You have to listen to this piece of paper. Or, or like insert any other multitude of tests, right? Like stool tests, hormone tests, whatever it might be. And that's kind of effed up too, right? The functional side, the side that's supposed to be better and more hip with these things, like our side is also oftentimes teaching people to not trust their body and not trust their experience. So it's like they get this triple whammy of, and heaven forbid they had trauma or challenges in the past that led them to be in this position in the first place. But it's like they have this quadruple whammy of really not feeling like they could trust their body and trust their signals and listen to their body. And then a well-intentioned practitioner or influencer might tell them, oh, just eat intuitively. And it's like little cartoon question marks are flying up in people's brains. And I think it becomes really messy really quickly. So Jessica, do you want to kind of take it from here for a moment and weigh in on that thought?
Yeah, you're coming into what's the real root cause? And do practitioners know how to find it? And then do they know what to do with it once they do discover it? And that's the world that I work in, which is if you feel like your body has betrayed you with an IBS diagnosis because it took you off guard out of left field, then you aren't going to be able to trust yourself. Oh, can I trust my body if I just all of a sudden was sideswiped by this diagnosis? That's the root cause. And so then we're looking at the downstream, and functional medicine isn't prepared or trained to help people work with the root belief causes that they have. And either is the people working in intuitive eating. And so what we're talking about is what is actually driving how people stay safe. And this is why disordered eating can be a way that people are attempting to stay safe, the way that they form their relationship with food when they have an event where they feel like their body betrayed them and they feel like they can't trust how foods are going to behave in their body. That's the real root issue. And that's one of the reasons why I love self-compassion so much, is because the world that I work in is understanding what my clients believe and why. What happened to you? Let's talk about your experience. And then how do people learn the skills? And these are not difficult skills to learn. Learn the skills of leaning into an internal resource that we all have, which is kindness towards ourselves, doing hard things, will actually change the belief system that's driving all of our eating habits, and also the thing that very well-meaning practitioners in the functional medicine field just haven't figured out how to change it, or they don't have the time. They don't have the time or the resources to sit down and do that with their clients. I hope that sort of sets the tone a little differently.
Yeah, well, and I'd argue too that I would say some or most of the functional providers probably are disordered eating themselves too, or struggle with some degree of disordered eating too. Or at least that's been my experience. But yeah, this is such an interesting conversation because in reality, like nourishing your body is at the core of feeling safe. But then again, like everything kind of gets thrown off when the disordered eating comes into play, and it makes you feel safer to manipulate the diet and have a sense of the control there. And it can be hard then to reestablish of like, oh no, we need to really kind of pull some stuff back into the diet, get you more nourished, because again, at the core, like the whole feeling safe conversation, like you have to be nourished to feel safe too. And that gets sort of lost in the sauce with our clients all the time, because so much of the discussion is around what you're talking about of like, oh no, that broccoli could set off all the IBS symptoms. Like that broccoli will send you over the edge. You know, they're getting all these messages, and then that's becoming their belief. Like all their beliefs, like all of these peppering of different messages are becoming their belief, that food is really the enemy in some way and not safe. And again,
Right. We will formulate safety mechanisms that will override intuition. And
yeah,
if they're, and so when we look at how extreme this can get in the world of functional medicine, when we have someone, for instance, who might have multiple sclerosis or lupus, things that are incredibly serious, and we feel like it's all on us, it's on my shoulders. One wrong bite,
yeah,
by one bite, I can cause a flare that could potentially have a deep and lasting impact on the quality of my life. That's incredibly dysregulated. It's a form of hypervigilance. It keeps our nervous system in sympathetic dominance, and also the other piece is they're not doing anything wrong because they're working to the best of their ability to try to
yeah,
navigate a really challenging experience. And then they go to a well-meaning practitioner that says, and by the way, I want you on 10 more supplements and I want you on this restricted diet. And it just piles up and people start to feel incredibly hopeless. There's so much shame, like, oh, am I strong enough to be on this restrictive diet? Do I have what it takes? Do I have the courage? And it becomes this thing where the weight of the strength needed to heal becomes part of the equation as well. And that's actually why I got into this world, because I was in the world of autoimmune paleo, and I had so many people developing disordered eating symptoms because of their IBD or their MS, and they crumbled under the weight of the pressure that they felt like was facing them in order to just manage their illness.
yeah,
And that was why I said that enough is enough. We have to start really screening people to find out, do they have disordered eating as they go into work with a functional medicine doctor? What's their belief system? What kind of resources do they have? But then also developing a kindness approach to how hard it is to have an illness, to have an autoimmune disease, even to do SIBO. SIBO is so debilitating for so many people. And when a normal person says, I've been bloated and constipated and brain fogged for so long, I think it must be me, because I'm doing exactly what everybody tells me to do and I'm
right.
still not getting better. It must be me. I must be missing something. And that kind of internalized pressure is very dysregulating to the nervous system. And it ultimately impacts people's primary relationship to food. And people, I think,
Yeah.
live in shame.
I was just going to say, I want to go to something that you brought up in the class that I took too. And I think it'll add context to what we were talking about, which is like, we're not denying that food could elicit symptoms or that food could be a genuine trigger for what you're experiencing, right? Like, you could very well eat onion or broccoli or something and have it trigger diarrhea or bloating. You could eat something like tomatoes and have it trigger joint pain. So these are real things. I think the difference that I really appreciated from the class that I took with you was this idea of approaching nutrition and approaching self-care from a perspective of what is practical versus this like really fear-driven, lack-driven, like scrambly, like I have to fix something because I'm broken. I have to save myself because I'm in danger. Like, you want to speak to the difference between those two things?
Yeah, so that's a great point, Nikki. So it's a difference between managing our illness from a deficit by believing something about yourself that isn't necessarily true, but feels like it's true in the moment because it's such a big thing that you're navigating. Oh my gosh, I just got this scary diagnosis. My body betrayed me. When we eat from a place of my body betrayed me, we are compensating for the betrayal and that negative core or the untrue core belief that's the primary driver of your relationship with food. Versus the practical piece, which you brought up so brilliantly, which is, my gosh, some people have issues with tomatoes and onions. But because scary things are happening to us and we don't have help to sort out, what do you believe about your circumstances in life? What's not true here, but feels true and is helping you actually manage a really hard situation. That's what I call eating. Your primary relationship with food is actually occurring out of a deficit, not practicality. And so I work with both practitioners and individuals to sort those two things out. And again, this is things that I'm finding aren't being done very much in the field of psychology or in the field of intuitive eating, or in the field of functional medicine. I think because we're just starting to understand the implications of this, because in a lot of ways, social media and restrictive dieting are having their shining moments in maybe the last decade. But before that, you had to kind of search it out. You had to go to a bookstore and find the book to read about it. And now it's saturating our media sphere. Oh, you have an issue with that? Here's a diet for that. And I have, 10 people on speed dial that are the best practitioners in functional medicine. I'm going to go see what they have to say. So we have so much more information that's coming towards us that's also impacting those negative core beliefs that all of us develop from hard things happening to us in life. Not just the diagnosis of a chronic illness. It could be because your parents got divorced and you felt like you were unlovable, or you had to declare bankruptcy and you felt like you have to, something is wrong with you, or getting fired from a job. These are things that I see all the time that have nothing to do with eating, but actually impact eating. But chronic illness is just one of the big ones. It's sort of like the low-hanging fruit for our conversation here.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think it's so fascinating. It's like with the especially in the IBS space, it's like these coping skills, like the restrictions become these coping skills that are just misaligned with what's actually going to help you in the long run. And I think it's so hard
Well
as
said.
practitioners to watch too, because I think what happens is, there's so much dysfunction maybe gut wise, and maybe in part because of the disordered eating too. I mean, if you're not nourished, your gut starts to break down and doesn't work as well. But I think what happens is that someone maybe cuts out a few foods and then it's like, oh, maybe that helped me feel a little bit better. Now I got to out more food. It's like this rabbit hole that's just like, it just gets narrower and narrower. And it's like, no, like, when are we going to
Yeah.
stop? And I think what generally typically helps is going back to the basics too of, trying to find ways to make the food feel safer and to like again bridge some of the gaps that you're describing. But yeah, it's such a vicious cycle once you get caught up in it. And I know personally I definitely had some disordered eating patterns during my gut journey too. And I think it can be so insidious because you can start adding some foods back in. And then what if you do actually have a little bit of like transitional symptoms? So working through those can be a whole Jedi mind trick where you're thinking, oh my gosh, like what if I'm reacting to this food? So it's so hard and it takes self-compassion to move through those transitional periods too when you do start working on this as well.
Yeah.
I always tell clients, and I've had conversations about this recently, where they're adding foods back in, but all these doubts are coming up of, oh my gosh, did I actually react to that? I'm not sure. Did I like it? Or again, what if I react to this food? And all these doubts are coming up. And I'll tell them too, I remember through my journey doubts coming up for a while, maybe for like 6 months to a year, and it becomes less and less. Like it's not happening as frequently, but as you sort of go outside your comfort zone, maybe you go to a party and there's a new food you haven't had in a really long time. And it's like, oh, there's some doubts that might come up. And so you kind of push yourself and say, hey, I'm just going to like see what happens. And like, again, you build trust by action. And I think that that's sometimes where I see people thinking they can kind of get their headspace back. And there's an aspect of that, but I almost think you have to, the way through is to act with some of this stuff. And I think from my standpoint, like the exposures are so important in working through this, if that makes sense. So the food exposures, and that doesn't mean you have to try, a whole pie or something extreme, like try a bite of the pie or something, see how that goes, and you can build up to it.
But also, if you want the whole pie, you go for it.
Right. But I think, again, there's a degree of when people are so freaked out, it's like, what's a baby step in the right direction? If you feel like you're really in a restrictive headspace at the time, what's like the baby step you can take? And then also just acknowledging there could be fears that come up, and that's okay. I think you can acknowledge that some of that stuff's there, and again, give yourself some compassion and grace to move through it. But that's something, again, I definitely experienced along my journey of like, hey, some of these things can just come up and it's going to make you feel kind of not safe or feel like you're dysregulated as you're kind of adding stuff in. But it's such an important part of the process to kind of build courage back in and do the hard things like you had mentioned earlier.
Well, Amy, let's look at that, because I think that's so cool how you brought that up. And probably for a lot of people listening, that idea of I'm doubting myself when I'm eating probably has come into a lot of people's minds. So let me put that through the lens of self-compassion. So one is I'll just explain what the definition of self-compassion is. So self-compassion is the action of extending kindness towards yourself. It's not about getting it right. It's not about fixing. It's about extending kindness towards yourself, often to places that feel scared and confused and that have messed up. So one is self-compassion is an internal care model and it's an action that we extend kindness. The three parts of self-compassion are mindfulness, self-kindness, and common humanity. And so it's this idea that we can be present with parts inside of us that are struggling or hurting, that we can offer those parts that are struggling or hurting kindness. And common humanity is this idea that it happens to all of us. Mm-hmm. So as you're talking, Amy, and you're saying when I was reintroducing foods and I had all these doubts, the one thing that I would say here that everybody can start doing now is we can, through that lens of kindness, is say, what is the part that is feeling doubt right now need from me? What can I give that part of myself that is scared and doubting and thinks what if I really mess up here? This feels so scary to not understand. If I eat one bite, will it set me back? Self-compassion is this idea of saying, what can I give myself right now that is doubting? When I say that, I am saying to myself, I'm going to say words of kindness. Like, this is a hard place to be in. It is scary. It is confusing. I'm going to be right here with you as you take a bite of the pie and we see what happens next. And no matter what happens, I'm going to be right here and you haven't done anything wrong. Now, when we do that, we will look, and I do this in my classes, we're going to look for the experience, Amy, that you're having as you say something nice to yourself, as you're doing something that feels potentially scary. Now, why does this work? Self-compassion has 3,000 studies that have shown that it is an internal care model that helps increase emotional resilience. So we know that people who practice what I just shared with you have better functioning immune systems. They have higher emotional resilience, which means when they encounter a challenge, they respond to it better. It doesn't mean that we're skirting challenging things in our life. It means we feel better prepared for the challenges once we face them. And this is incredibly important too, because we haven't talked about interoceptive awareness. That's incredibly important. In fact, it's one of the principles of intuitive eating, and yet it's not inherently taught in intuitive eating. And it is a set of skills that we all need to be able to trust the body signals that we have. So interoceptive awareness is the ability to accurately interpret what your body is telling you. I'm full, I'm going to stop eating. Oh my goodness, my bladder's full, I need to use the restroom. These are the things that interoceptive awareness helps us. So it's the link between what your body is telling you and what you're interpreting. But it turns out that there's many things that impact interoceptive awareness and make it harder to do. Chronic illness is one of the big ones. Being neurodivergent, being on medications, trauma. Those are all things that can really impact how well people accurately interpret the signals. Self-compassion, one of the reasons why I love it is that it helps increase interoceptive awareness. And compassion is also a principle of intuitive eating, but as I teach it, it's the central component. And then also looking at how we can add reparenting and understanding belief systems and using self-compassion is just so, it makes it more accessible for people who are wanting to do a self-care model for helping with their body image, for helping with disordered eating. Because there's, like I was saying, there's been 3,000 studies about self-compassion. And we know now, because of so much scientific literature that's come forward, that self-compassion increases the trust in your body signals, increases body image. It's a buffer against disordered eating. And when we look at what the state of our world is, I don't know if you guys get a subscription to the Washington Post, but just today where they were talking about how massive anxiety is an issue in the United States. And 1 out of 5 adults in the United States right now has an anxiety disorder. And we look at all the things that are kind of getting thrown at us that make it hard to understand how to safely eat. Then we're in need of skills. Now, the other thing I'm going to say too, I want to not forget to add this. Last year, I went through the teacher training at Stanford for becoming a compassion teacher. And one of the first things that they said that really shifted my entire life perspective was the neurobiology of compassion. When people practice compassion, it stimulates reward centers inside the brain versus empathy. And so empathy and self-compassion get often confused. And empathy actually lights up the pain centers of the brain. And so now we know that self-compassion works as well as it does because it stimulates a part of our brain that gives us constant reward. And that's one of the reasons why it helps with emotional resilience so much. It's an internal care model. Everybody can use, everybody can learn. It's not very complicated. It's just awkward at first because our culture is not used to being kind to ourselves, doing hard things. But once we get over that, we start practicing it, there's so much science that says it's going to help you. And that's one of the things that I really love about us having this conversation and why it's so useful. Because once people start practicing it, it starts stimulating this really cool battery inside of ourself that helps us believe in ourselves, helps us cope emotionally. And this is really important too, because as, for instance, I'll also talk about women for a minute. When women go through big hormonal events in our life, whether it be the onset of menstruation, whether it be the perimenopause or menopause, our fluctuation in hormones predispose us to disordered eating, cause our interoceptive awareness to go down because big hormonal changes in women naturally decrease leptin and ghrelin. And that is so important because when women go through menopause and they feel more hungry, it's not in their head like maybe they're told. It's actually a change that we see consistently in women that says like, oh, your hormones are actually dysregulating your hunger and your satiety cues. People aren't talking about this too much yet. And so this is another thing why I'm really glad we're having this kind of conversation.
Yeah, again, I love that you're bringing up self-compassion. It's interesting. It's something we've talked about here on the podcast for a bit. So I had a baby, she's a year now. So July 7th last year, and I kind of dealt with postpartum OCD anxiety issues that popped up. Well, a lot of the OCD practitioners I like, and even my therapist, would discuss self-compassion, which I think is kind of unique. I don't think tons of therapists are super hip to it. But yeah, we did similar to what you described, like a self-compassion break where you do kind of acknowledge what you're struggling with, acknowledge that everybody struggles, and then kind of be almost a cheerleader for yourself with a few phrases. So I would do those. And again, I really enjoyed it. I've gotten a little bit out of the practice of it, but you're reminding me to pull it back into the mix. And there's one, actually, I have a book here. Hold on.
Well, Amy, I want to say too that, that's a great one.
Self-compassion workbook for OCD. I have this one. And there was like a really interesting exercise in there too, where you could write like a little note for yourself that I used to kind of refer to sometimes. So I love the idea of, and I've utilized it too. It's I think been really helpful in my journey at times, but it is a practice. Like I think I've gotten a little out of the practice of it more recently. So like everything else, like we're not perfect. You can fall off the horse a little bit and have to pull yourself back. But yeah, this conversation has reminded me like, oh yeah, I need to be doing some of this stuff a little bit more.
Well, Amy, that's important that you brought that up. By the way, that's an amazing book. That if we were to give everybody listening the takeaway pearl of, what is the first thing that everybody can start doing today, that is a question that's going to open up self-compassion for everybody, which is, how would you treat yourself as a friend would treat you? And how often do you do that?
Yeah.
And when we talk about, for you, postpartum, that's a huge hormonal event. But that self-compassion always sticks with the two primary questions. What do you need that you can give yourself? And how can you treat yourself as a friend would? We often don't go to self-compassion because many people think that it is letting yourself off the hook of being responsible for your circumstances. But what we know is that, for instance, professional athletes that practice self-compassion actually perform better. So it's essentially being with yourself while you're struggling. It's not letting yourself off the hook. But there's a lot of misconceptions that if you practice self-kindness, it's a form of weakness and you're not following through. But we know that corporations that incorporate compassion strategies make more money, have better employee productivity, and people don't leave the company as often. So there's a lot of research that actually debunks the fears that people have. But that would be the primary takeaway for this conversation that we're all having is will you treat yourself as a friend like they would treat you? And what do you need right now? And those two questions will help start flexing that internal heart muscle of self-compassion that is available to everybody. And when you look at what we're talking about here, which is what about gut issues? So when we look at the research, there have been 57 studies that have mapped in the literature how irritable bowel disease or diseases associated with specific dietary restrictions, like in the IBD world or in the IBS world, 4 out of every 8 studies show a form of disordered eating associated with restrictive dieting. And that would bring us into this other concept that we haven't touched into, which is orthorexia, which is a form of disordered eating, which is quite rampant in the functional medicine field. if anybody hasn't heard of orthorexia, it's not an official diagnosis yet. It's close to being one. But orthorexia is a form of disordered eating where you place an unhealthy focus on eating in a healthy way. It's a preoccupation with eating in a healthy way. And orthorexia is something that we see quite rampant. I see it in people who are trying to eat healthy for illness or chronic illness. It's important here that we can eat healthy. We can make really smart, practical choices for our health. But if we have belief systems that say life is punishing you, you have to try hard to heal, your body betrayed you, all of those things are going to impact your primary relationship with food. And so that's the piece here that I know I keep sort of saying it over and over again, but that's the thing that we really want to look at in our clients, which is, what do they believe about food? What's their relationship with about food? What's their relationship about life? What's their relationship with their diagnosis? And if people answer those questions as I'm posing that to them, they'll start to unpack a lot of the basic belief systems, which, by the way, tend to be driven through habits in our unconscious mind. That is, we can start to unpack it and see what the truth is about how we're living our life and our relationship with food. But we do know that high stress and transitions in life are likely triggers for eating disorders and disordered eating. So any kind of period of vulnerability is going to put us more at risk for disordered eating and eating disorders. And like I think I was saying before, I hope it got into the recording, it came out today that 1 in 5 people in the United States have an anxiety disorder. And so we have a lot of dysregulated nervous system people who are trying to figure out how to be more regulated. And an unhealthy relationship with food is often a very low-hanging fruit to trying to have regulation in our life. But there's better regulation in life. There's a better and a more efficient system, and that's self-compassion.
Yeah. Do you have any, in terms of particularly spotting disordered eating, are there any key signs that someone listening could check themselves on of, I'm not sure, I definitely have some restrictive eating patterns and I feel like I might have some disordered eating? Do you have any specific examples of what you would consider disordered eating? Because I think that that's a little bit confusing for people in terms of an outright eating disorder. It's such a spectrum, and sometimes even I get a little confused on where the lines are. Like, to me, some of the same methods could probably help someone who has an outright eating disorder and someone that has disordered eating. But that, I think, is confusing to people because they'll say, well, I feel like I don't necessarily have what would be diagnosed as an eating disorder, but I have all these beliefs that are, and again, it could be semantics, really, but if you could give kind of some general examples of what disordered eating typically looks like, that would be probably helpful for some of our listeners too.
One, people can go online or work with their therapist or their healthcare provider to actually take the tests. The ortho test is a good one, but if you Google disordered eating test, there's 2 that I know of will come up and they can actually take the test. But the other thing for me is I ask my clients, what's your relationship to food? How often are you thinking about food? And so what percentage of your life are you actually thinking about food? And what I'm finding is that so many people are living in silence and shame because they're thinking about food all the time and they don't know the very first step to take when that's happening. And so that, Amy, to answer that, that's the first question I ask in my own private practice, which is, how is this unfolding in your life? What do you see the role of food in your life as? What's your relationship to food, and how much time in your life are you thinking about food, preparing food, how food's going to keep you safe, how it's going to keep you satisfied, how it's going to give you a break from all the stress that you're experiencing.
Yeah, I think the percentage of time is so huge to me. You can see that sometimes with clients. And again, if you've just generally for a long period of time have thought about food, you just might not be totally aware that that's not necessarily where you want to be, is thinking about food all the time. If it's kind of your reference range is off. If this has just been something that's been built internally for a long period of time, it feels very normal to you to think about food all the time. But yeah, I mean, I think that's probably one of the things too to think about with disordered eating is, what other things would you like to fill your time with too? That's another thing I find helpful with my clients as well, is they're always saying, oh, when I'm better, I want to do this. And when now I'm broken and I can't do that. So I need to focus on food. And it's, well, maybe we can do, for me, it was basketball. I tell this story all the time, but I would say, oh, I'm too sick to play basketball. And then eventually I was like, well, screw it. I'm going to play basketball. And maybe I can't play the whole game, because I was struggling with some energy issues and things like that, but I can play a quarter. And it was sort of like getting back into living and focusing on other things really helped me. And that's another, I think, helpful tip for people that are struggling, is thinking a little bit more about, same thing with self-compassion too. What would light me up or bring me joy, or be something that I need today? Which could be connection, that kind of stuff, treating yourself with kindness and prioritizing joy. I think trying to, even if you're just trying to do more of that, it could also, in another way, decrease the amount of time you're spending thinking about food in kind of a backwards way too. But yeah, I like.
Well, can I say something?
Yeah, for sure.
So that's a great point, Amy, because the two things that I hear. So one is everybody who's listening to us, ask yourself this question, like, how do I feel about how much time, energy, and effort it takes for me to manage my gut issues?
Yeah.
Okay, so take a second and just answer that internally. And I'm going to tell everybody the two things that I hear most often is I'm exhausted and I feel alone. And then when we're talking about this conversation, is this approach going to make me feel exhausted and more alone? And self-compassion is an interconnected care model. So it's not reasonable to ask people who are feeling exhausted and alone to add on one more modality of that's going to make them feel more alone, and it's going to make them feel more exhausted. And self-compassion is the antidote to both of those things, because people are still not talking about their struggles with food. I'm finding that often it's still very much a secret that people keep to themselves, that they often don't even tell their partners or their best friends. And so that's another reason why I think that this is so important and so relevant right now, is that there's neurobiology that shows that it will help you get connected into the places inside of yourself that are going to help you feel less alone. It's also going to connect inside of the place that you're not going to be fixing what you feel like is broken, because fixing is often something that we have to repair that's wrong with ourselves, where self-compassion is really a remembering our wholeness process. So oftentimes in functional medicine, we're told we need to fix what's broken. Self-compassion is a remembering our wholeness, which by virtue gets us more connected inside of ourselves and helps start feeding that self-trust that it's safe to listen to my body cues, that I feel like life is punishing me. Oh, wait, hold on a second. I can trust myself. It doesn't feel like life is punishing me as much as it did before. So we're looking for the experience, like you said prior, Amy, about that experience. We want the experience of safety and trust inside of ourselves that gives us a leg to stand on so that we have the confidence to start building a care plan from a different place. It's not from a lack deficient place because we feel like life is punishing us. We're going to eat from a place of like, okay, this is hard, people, and I'm terrified and I'm not exactly sure how it's going to turn out, but I'm with myself as I'm taking this journey. So you ever notice that you guys might feel the difference even as I'm talking about that?
Yeah, and it's similar to
This is not talked about often.
Yeah, it's similar to what you were talking about before, operating again from the deficit. It's like instead focusing on, how can you fill your cup and treat yourself with kindness, in a way that's, again, we don't want to overburden someone too, where it's like, oh, they're doing too much all at once, because that's another issue that we see where it's like, okay, we're going to do a million things. But yeah, I think I really like the self-compassion model, and it's really important. And a lot of people, again, view themselves as being broken. And I don't think I've worked with someone that's been broken, like that I would describe as broken. I think in a weird way too, a lot of times the body, some people view certain things that I see as breaking down, and the body's just adapting to certain things too. Like, I'm a big believer in the body's really smart. So, sometimes the body, if you are not getting enough nutrition for various reasons, like the body might adjust in different ways that might create symptoms or make you not feel super great. But in a lot of ways, the body's trying to help you or protect you. So I think that the body, again, like can manifest in things in different ways that make you feel like the body's against you. But most of the time, the body has so many protective mechanisms that are trying to help you. But yeah, it's sometimes hard to move through the chronic issues, and you really want to make sure, I think, you're finding providers that aren't making you feel worse or shamed. Or I almost sometimes think about, okay, how did I feel coming out of that appointment with that person when I'm working with a provider in a way? Like, it's a good exercise, because sometimes I've worked with providers where I come out of the appointment being like, I actually feel kind of shitty. Like, this didn't really help me in a weird way. It made me feel worse. But I think that can be a good exercise too. Not that you can't have conversations that might push you in a different way with a provider, but I still think that usually you can kind of tell if someone might be dysregulating you if you're paying attention to after how you're feeling working with a provider.
Well, I think to kind of throw it to the current day and age that we live in, as the kids would say, when the vibes are off.
Yeah, the vibes are
right.
off.
Like, I think there's a difference between that feeling that the vibe is off, like you guys didn't click, they didn't meet you where you're at, they didn't provide something that you needed or wanted. There's a difference between that versus, kind of to your point, sometimes you are going to have experiences or appointments or interactions that are just crappy and they feel bad. But like, I'm picturing, for example, somebody could walk out of an appointment with a doctor and they just receive news that they have stage 4 cancer. They're not going to be skipping through the rainbows and farting with the unicorns after that appointment. No matter how good the doctor is, they're probably going to feel awful. But there's a difference between like receiving hard news or hearing something that you don't really want to hear. Maybe somebody with an eating disorder who's told that they have an eating disorder. Maybe nobody has told them that up until this point, and they know it to be true, but they haven't been examining that, or they've been kind of avoiding that. And then that first doctor tells them, or dietitian or whoever, that first provider tells them, hey, I think you have an actual eating disorder. Like, that person's not going to be happy to hear that. But there's a difference between that versus what you described. Like, again, the vibes are off. Like, that person, their approach or their tone or like the way that they're trying to motivate me and elicit change, like the tools that they're using just don't match what I need in this moment. And it's like not a good fit. I think that there's a difference between the two.
And I have
I
like a
wanted
good.
to throw in.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think a good example of that is sometimes I'll work with people and they'll do kind of chronometer data for their nutrition just to get a sense of what their gaps are and things like that. And some people will say, "Oh yeah, that was a weird day. I had a little bit of sugar that day." Like they're nervous to just say, "Hey, like it was my birthday. I had birthday cake. Like that's amazing. You got to enjoy like awesome cake." But they're worried because they work with providers that would say like, if you eat an ounce of sugar, I don't know, your gut's never going to heal. You're getting really intense, shamey messages. Like, how dare you enjoy that birthday cake on your birthday? And it's so you get a sense of that having worked with people where they get so nervous to share with providers like us, like their diet. It's almost, again, feels very vulnerable to look at chronometer data. And I think, I try my best to create a safe space where someone can tell me flat out what they're eating, and we can kind of, again, work on it from a nourishing standpoint. But it always breaks my heart when situations happen like that because, there can sometimes be internal things. So maybe not a practitioner driven thing where they just have a belief that sugar's bad or read about it, and it's more something that has developed from within them. But I think a lot of our clients have all the external messages, like we've talked about, from providers, where they've been guilted and shamed so much to eat a certain way that, again, like you'll have these experiences where it's like, oh no, like I hate that you feel so like shamed that you had a little bit of birthday cake. Like I hope you enjoyed your birthday. Like that'd be more my question than,
Well,
go ahead.
that's where we need to ask the question, which is, how do we actually heal shame?
Right.
So self-compassion is really an antidote to shame. And then we look at how are people coming to the conclusions that they are, where one bite of sugar and a birthday cake is both going to elicit a response from a practitioner who, by the way, is living in their own belief system that has limiting things. So we have to then start to say, I've had these circumstances in my life that seem like evidence to back up the things that I've decided about myself that are actually not true. So let's use an example. A young girl gets bullied for her weight when she is in middle school. If she has nobody to intervene with that experience, she's going to try to make sense of it as best she can. So let's say she decides that she's unlovable and that people are always going to turn on her. Then she gets married and her husband cheats on her. She's going to use that experience as evidence to back up the belief that people are always going to betray her. Then she turns 45 and she gets a diagnosis of lupus. She's going to use that diagnosis that everything, including her body, is going to betray her. And that starts from a negative core belief that never got remedied, that was made very innocently to just try to make sense out of a very challenging situation. And so we look at all of these things of like, is chronic illness actually could help us in some way? It can help us understand what it is that we believe about ourselves that actually isn't true. How do we clear that up? We can lean into the power of our deep care inside of ourselves. I'm so sorry that happened to you. This is something that maybe this woman might say to herself. This is where the reparenting that I do, paired with self-compassion, comes in. I'm so sorry that bullying happened to you. What do you need? Or what might she have needed in that moment? What we know about compassion is it's not bound by space or time. And this is how we think about the first time any of us have ever been in love. We didn't know what love felt like until we actually went through and did it. We didn't know what falling in love for the first time felt like with our mind. We had to experience it. And so when we look at this idea of being kind to ourselves, we can experience it. And just like we can remember how much we loved our first pet, we can actually use compassion for things that happened to us even a very long time ago. While we can do it with a therapist, it's not required, because reparenting is giving ourselves something that we didn't get in childhood. And when we pair it with self-compassion, it's a very effective format. And it's incredibly useful for people who have forms of disordered eating or orthorexia, especially with chronic gut issues. I haven't found actually anything better.
Yeah, I commented, I think in our last class, Jessica, that this is really cool because I think it kind of vaguely reminds me of like watching Sailor Moon in the 90s, where a lot of the theme of that show and a lot of similar shows is like the power of love is the thing that's stronger than all of these bad guys, all of these boogeymen, all of like the final bosses that Sailor Moon had to fight. It was the power of love and friendship that overcame all of that and gave her the strength to carry on through these really tough battles. And similarly, it's like human beings are going to face challenges. All of us will face challenges. And I think the remedy to that is just being compassionate with yourself and present with yourself and doing this kind of work. So it's really neat because I feel like this is like I don't want to say the cure for everything, but to kind of dramatize it, it's kind of the cure for everything in a weird way. It's just being kind to yourself and present with yourself.
Yeah, because when we are challenged, the habit of humans is to say, if I can't meet the challenge, there must be something wrong with me. And what we're saying is everybody gets challenged and we can be kind to ourselves as we're going through the challenge. Now, that's not very easy, and we don't have a lot of practice in our culture, but it's a really effective path. And it's the path that I found just really effective for people who are exhausted and feel alone. Because then they're like, oh, there's something inside of me, that there's this internal toolkit that I got born with that's going to help me go through this struggle.
Yeah. And one thing you mentioned too earlier, which I just want to circle back to a little bit, is just some of this stuff might not feel natural at first. I know for me, when I was doing a lot of self-compassion breaks, initially working with my therapist, just being like, oh, this feels a little bit weird. But eventually it feels less weird. It's almost a fake it until you make it situation. So definitely give it time if you're going to practice self-compassion, and don't just say, oh, this feels way too foreign and weird for me. That's probably how it's going to feel. So I just wanted to throw that out there too, because I know you'd mentioned it earlier. And I would say I definitely felt a little bit weird at first trying to figure out how to talk to yourself in a self-compassionate way, sort of. So like what would being a cheerleader for myself somewhat, or like, what do I need to hear in this moment? Kind of coming up with phrases felt a little awkward at first, but again, I eventually felt a lot less awkward. So just know that there's probably a bit of a familiarizing yourself and building the habit that's going to take place. Like, you're awkward if you start trying something new anyway. It's going to be similar to that, but it might be even a little bit more intense at first if you've never really practiced self-compassion before.
It's very awkward. Mm-hmm. And there's a phenomenon in self-compassion called backdraft. And backdraft is this phenomenon that when you start practicing being kind to yourself, things feel worse, or they can feel like you're stirring old issues up again. And that's very normal. And it's also really normal that when you start to practice kindness for yourself, you're going to have voices inside of your mind and your heart that say, don't go there. You don't need to. You already worked that out. You've already done that. You don't need, our plan is working just fine. And so also I really prep all the people that I work with that that's going to happen. And also, Amy, that's great that you brought that up, because it's a good reason to get into a group with other people that are practicing awkward things so that you feel less alone.
Yeah, it's like your brain needs some time to rewire in a way too, with practicing self-compassion and getting out of the thought patterns and things that are not really aligned with where you want to go. So yeah, I definitely give it some time. Don't throw in the towel if you're feeling a little bit like, oh, this is not typically how I talk to myself. That's the point. You're practicing something new, and yeah, so hang in there.
Well, it's kind of like this. I think that sometimes I'll try to give people an idea of how long to try something before they pass a judgment on it, right? So I had this come up recently. I don't think I've told you about this. So Jessica, I do something called prokinetic speed dating with my patients and students where a prokinetic helps regulate motility. So it's really helpful for IBS and SIBO, but it's a total crapshoot which one people are going to end up liking. And I've been tracking the stats from my practice for years and years, and I have yet to figure out a pattern of like constipated people like this, diarrhea people like this. So anyway, so I just have people try them all. And this came up recently where I have people try or speed date each prokinetic for about 1 week or a little bit more than a week. And I usually tell people with that most often you'll start to see a difference with a prokinetic. If it's the one for you, you're going to see some sort of a difference, usually by like day 3, 4, or maybe 5. So giving it a full week, I think is enough time to really pass a judgment on it and decide, do you want to buy more Motil Pro or no? Or more motility activator or no? But I had a patient recently that he tried to do the speed dating, but I don't know, like we laughed about it afterwards, but he had told me that he was on like the 5th prokinetic and I had only seen him like 2 weeks prior. And I was like, how is that possible? He was only trying each for 2 days. I was like, oh, no, sweetie, you need to slow way down. Let's have you do it for, at least 5 days, if not a week. And that's more of a fair assessment. Or like when I have people try mouth taping, I'll tell them, give it a solid 2 weeks before you pass a judgment on it, before you decide if it's for you or not, because it might take you that long to get used to it. But like we could say the same thing for self-compassion work. Like we could say, give it at least 3 months before you decide if it's like worthwhile for you. But here's the thing. Are you really going to say with a straight face that self-compassion is not worthwhile to you or that you don't want to be self-compassionate? Like that'd be such a weird thing to come to the conclusion of. So like either way, you could do this, even if you don't think it's working or you don't see the results of it per se. Like this is something that you might just want to do, kind of in the realm of like drinking water every day. Like this just might need to be a practice that every human being does because it's a good idea and it's good for you. And like, why wouldn't you do it?
Exactly. And we have issues in our culture that are showing that people are struggling. And so it's scary to try something new. It can feel, you can have a lot of apprehension, but there is so much research and scientific data now that shows it's an effective path. It doesn't have side effects. It integrates with almost every kind of medical approach. It aligns with therapy. I haven't found any side effects or drawbacks to self-compassion other than it's clunky, awkward, and it can be really scary to give up the belief systems that are really limiting and untrue just because they've been there for so long and they're like old friends. So
yeah, one other thing too about like culturally too, I mean, practicing self-compassion obviously helps you, but I'd almost think it would help you be more self-compassionate with other people, which, I mean, I feel like people seem to give each other less grace these days, I feel like, than previous periods of time. That's just my sort of feeling of it. It seems like everyone's just about ready to bite each other's head off half the time. So probably, or again, like write someone off for something they said flippantly, or I just feel like there's not much grace being given with other people too. So I'd imagine just culturally as a whole, practicing it yourself would help you be more self-compassionate for someone else, which is probably a good thing culturally. Our culture probably needs a hefty dose of self-compassion these days, just based on what I'm seeing on the internet and on the news and things like that. So just another thought about all the everything going on culturally too. It seems like we need some self-compassion for sure.
Well, this might dovetail into something. Hopefully, I know we talked about this a little bit in the class, so hopefully it's okay to bring this up in this capacity too. But Do you have any desire, Jessica, to like briefly weigh in on kind of the current uprising of what we could call anti-diet culture and how this can further kind of feed into some of these issues and how this kind of dovetails into it? Because I thought that part of the conversation was interesting. Like here we were a group of, nutritionists and dietitians and healthcare professionals in this class that you taught. And like I even joked, I think it was the first class because I was eating lunch during all of our calls because there was a time zone difference and it was at my lunchtime. And I think I might have shared in the beginning or one of the calls even that because of the current state of things and the state of the world and how diets are seen as bad oftentimes, like, and there could be some shame and guilt and like weirdness if you say that you're on a diet or if you're trying to eat a certain way. And like there was a little pang, like one neuron in my brain that felt slightly self-conscious that I was in this like relationship with eating, disordered eating, food theory kind of class. And here I was having a plate of like baby carrots and hummus and cucumbers. And there was like one neuron in my brain that thought, oh my God, like what if they think that I have food issues because I'm eating this plate of healthy stuff? Like, what if they judge me for it? But do you want to speak at all to the anti-diet culture and like this idea that diets are intrinsically bad and how much shame and guilt there is in the world right now for just trying to eat a certain way?
Yeah, whenever we assume that we know the right way, we pretty much haven't figured out a way that's going to be useful for people. And the anti-diet movement, I think, has incredibly good intentions. We know that, 80-90% of diets don't work. But then you start to look at, well, what's the difference between a diet and a lifestyle? And how did all of the people who are so well-meaning, who are saying, don't diet, diets are bad, how did they come to that conclusion? Did they experience a bunch of diets and have an experience that showed them what didn't work for them? We don't want to rob that from other people because we're living in a political state right now where people's choices are being legislated out. And it is a choice to go on a diet, and it is a choice to take a step that feels right to you because it's based on your personal preferences and your life experience. And I would never propose to tell somebody a right or a wrong way. What I would propose is to be very loving and support them as they experiment with things in their life to figure out what works for them and what doesn't. And I've seen a lot of really well-intentioned people who maybe just don't understand how to help people on a deeper level with the belief systems that are driving things like going on a diet, and that is more of the issue. So I feel like personal choice is paramount to our existence in our culture that we live in the United States. And I see a lot of taking away people's choice by putting a low moral value on you if you choose a diet. Oh, you're choosing a diet? You're buying into diet culture. Who buys into diet culture? Only dumb, uneducated people, or it's like there's assumptions there that I feel like we have to be really careful about. And one thing that I don't do with my clients is I do not make assumptions. I allow them to experiment without harming themselves. Experiment without harming themselves. I will step in if I'm concerned about self-harm. But other than that, experience is the teacher of wisdom. So,
well, and again, it goes back to this idea of doing something from a lack and like deficit mindset versus doing something because it makes sense and it's practical or because you love yourself. Yep. Like, are you going on a diet to lose 20 pounds because you think that you're unlovable in your current state, but you'll be lovable if you're skinnier, or because, somebody picked on you in middle school or whatever? Or are you going on a diet to try to lose 20 pounds because you love yourself and this is like the next step in your journey? This is something that you want to do for yourself, or you just want more years on this planet or more years with your loved ones, or, I think that you could approach the same scenario, the idea of somebody doing a diet to lose weight, which would be so taboo in a lot of circles in the internet now. And you could approach it in two different ways, one of which is very healthy and one of which is very unhealthy and possibly damaging and kind of feeding into this issue that we've talked about.
Exactly. So if you took an anti-inflammatory diet, is so helpful for longevity and chronic illness. But if you're going on a diet because you're terrified if you don't eat a certain way, you might die, those are two different approaches. And so we're not accounting for taking the time to find out what your client's approach is and why.
Yeah, I think it's all about the approach. It's all about the lens that you come into it with. And that being said, there was one more thing that I really wanted to extract out of you in this episode, if I may, and anything else you're willing to share with us. But kind of in a similar vein, the idea of like, your approach to food, your approach to nourishment, and like the rules that you make about food and nourishment and diets kind of brings up the idea of the inner eater from your course. And I would love to hear you speak a little bit on what is the inner eater, how can somebody kind of check in with their inner eater, and like the thing that came up a lot in the course that I took with you was this idea of what role does the inner eater serve in your life? I remember that being pretty key, and that like opened up a lot of revelations, I think, for clients and some of the examples that you shared. So can you go into the inner eater just a little bit?
Sure. So our inner eater is a part inside of us that is making important decisions about how to eat, why to eat, and what way to eat. And our inner eater is informed by most often things that aren't in current time. So our inner eater is informed by things that have been happening to us over the course of our life. And our inner eater is making some pretty important decisions about how, for instance, food can keep us safe or in control or provide relief from anxiety. And so our inner eater is a part of us that we can get in contact with and connect with and work with, so that we can be sure that our inner eater is not working for a place of trying to fill in a deficit and instead be on our team. And so I walk my clients through how to use self-compassion to get in touch with their inner eater and figure out what their inner eater believes. And then sometimes, even if it feels okay for them, to develop a practice of self-compassion towards their inner eater. Because our inner eater is usually trying to accomplish something it thinks is best for us, but oftentimes isn't. But again, these are all things that sort of lie in the unconscious and our unconscious habits and patterning that we have in life.
Yeah, and it makes me think, some examples of that might be, again, like you said, the girl who's picked on for being a little bit heavier in middle school, and then she forms beliefs that she's not lovable and people are going to turn on her. I've been doing some of this work now, applying what I learned in the class with you with a patient of mine. And she kind of coincidentally has been doing some like limbic retraining programs at the same time. And she's come to some revelations on her own. And we kind of talk about it in our sessions. But, she came to the realization that somewhere along the way, she formed the belief that she has to earn her calories.
Yeah.
Like somehow, usually with exercise, she feels like she has to earn her calories and earn her right to eat. And so that's pretty foundational. Like this woman came to me with IBS, bloating, constipation, feeling like she didn't digest food very well. She was pretty convinced that her body just did not like carbs, that carbs were just out of the equation for her. But we got talking a lot about her history of disordered eating and her history of being in a profession that demands a certain type of physique. She was in like show business for a little while there. And, we started exploring this, and I realized pretty early on that she was running like a 600 calorie deficit every single day. So she was way undernourished. But again, like how helpful would it have been? I ask this facetiously. How helpful would it have been for me to see her as a patient with bloating and constipation, for me to tell her, oh, here's some motility activator and here's a probiotic and, you're good now. And here's some HCl. How well would that have served her if she still had the incorrect belief that she needs to earn every calorie that she puts in her body through movement?
Right.
And
Exactly.
how well would that serve her if she was still not eating enough and undernourishing herself? Right. So it's
Right.
like, this is the root of the root of the root for so many
Yeah.
people.
And in an odd way, perhaps we can count on life giving us, challenging the thing that we believe about ourselves that goes against our innate goodness. And so you can give her all of the supplements and it might really, really, really help. But if there's something that she believes about herself that challenges her own innate goodness, then life will often say, are you sure? Do you want to reconsider? Here's another challenge that's going to maybe seem like evidence to back up the deficiency you believe about yourself. But what it's trying to do is saying, will you choose differently about yourself? Will you claim your goodness? And that's why I love this work so much, is because every day I get to do that with my clients. And it's really beautiful when people can have the experience of reclaiming that. And it's really good for your health and your gut.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's almost like you're just facing head-on core fears is sort of what I'm hearing a lot too. Like there's these core fears underneath a lot of these like food beliefs and choices that you're making, and it's you have to really scrounge and dig a little bit to maybe get to the core fundamental fear underneath there. And again, like that fear's trying to pull you away and say, are you sure about that? I keep thinking of the meme are you sure about that? Do you know what I'm talking about? There's like it's from a Netflix show. It's a guy. And so people kind of put it in the background, but it's just like that. It's this guy or woman in your head, guy in your head going, are you sure about that? Half the time. But yeah, it's essentially like core fear work. And if you can kind of dig to the bottom and move kind of away from the fear into like, again, a place of self-compassion and giving yourself grace. So I'd imagine this work would be really cool. I can't wait this is creating some fun little ideas in my head to continue like working on different things with clients too, from more of a self-compassion lens. So I've loved, again, like having you on and talking through some of these things because it opens more doors, continue to learn, continue to try to find different ways to approach different things. And again, it is hard. It's always hard when, as someone that has had disordered eating and worked through it fairly, again, I think I'm completely on the other side of the disordered eating side of things. It always, again, like you want to have different tools in the tool belt to help as many people as possible. And I think self-compassion is a huge one that would, again, pretty much help everybody. I don't know who would gain from self-compassion. So, yeah.
And to your point earlier, it's not going to hurt anything. And also, it's free. You could be compassionate to yourself. You could be kind to yourself for free all day, every day. So, everybody's lining up to do $200, $300 SIBO breath tests and taking fancy schmancy proprietary herbal blends and buying organic this and that. And like those things are fine and great and maybe helpful, but like you could do this thing for free and it might really, really, really help you. And I want to weave in one more thing briefly. And then I want to be mindful of your time here because this was such a great and in-depth and long episode. And I appreciate your time being here. But I think that this directly ties into the vagus nerve in so many different ways. And there is some research on this even, but I remember I haven't read it, or maybe if I read it, I'm getting it mixed up with other papers. But I found one paper on PubMed. I believe the title was The Compassionate Vagus. And it's kind of talking about this connection with self-compassion and the vagus nerve, and going back to the idea of interoceptive awareness, which is a piece of this whole world that you just wove together for us. I happened to take a vagus nerve class shortly before joining your class. It was like a pre-recorded. Funny enough, the woman who teaches it is also named Jessica. Jessica McGuire. She's on Instagram. I believe her handle is Repairing the Nervous System. But I took her vagus nerve course, and she brought up the idea of interoceptive awareness a ton throughout that course, and how interoceptive awareness is, it's one half of the coin, with the other half of the coin being this idea of vagal tone or vagal function. So it all kind of weaves together so beautifully, this idea of self-compassion, interoceptive awareness, like body awareness, taking care of yourself, being kind to yourself, like fueling yourself. It all just kind of folds together in this really beautiful, holistic way. And I don't know what else to say. It's just, it all kind of folds in to make this beautiful little package. And I thank you for bringing that package here to the IBS Freedom Podcast. It was fabulous.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me and being willing to talk a little bit about this thing that is very helpful, but perhaps new to the people who are listening, but also perhaps inspiring. So thank you both for having me and being willing to talk about this.
Yeah, of course.
Absolutely.
You can come back anytime.
It was a pleasure. And guys, again, you could find her. She's very consistent. Jessica Brown is at The Loving Diet. So her book, The Loving Diet, Instagram, The Loving Diet, website, The Loving Diet. If you forget these handles, then I don't know, you need some acetylcholine, man. It's pretty easy to remember, but check out The Loving Diet on all of the handles, all the platforms. She's a wealth of knowledge. She teaches classes for practitioners and regular folk too. You have a group course. Yep. So there's lots of ways that people could take a deeper dive into this, or as a baby step, you could just start being a little bit more compassionate to yourself, starting right here and right now. So I think there's a lot of ways that people can get into this world and get into this work, but I think that it has the potential to greatly help a great many people. And I appreciate your time coming here and telling us about it.
Thank you both. It was great to be here.